Sometimes we have to align the inputs for our simply input values that have been converted to smaller numbers. If we were talking about our input or x values were years, and right now it's 2016, that's going to be a really high x value to have, and then to go from there. So maybe we would have x equals 0 at 2000, and then x could equal 16 for the year 2016. So you convert it by same amount from each, so here would be subtracting 2000 from each. That's what it means to align the data. Between 1950 and 2008, the percent of voting population who voted in presidential elections, during those every 4 years, is given by this equation, where x is the number of years after 1950. That is the input value, x equals 0 represents 1950. And if you think about that, x equals 0, make this 0, x equals 0, make this 0. So it says in 1950, 75.26% of the voting population would have voted in the presidential election that year, except 1950 wouldn't have been a presidential election year. We'd have to start with 52. Okay. So what values of x correspond to the years 1964 and 2008? Well, what we're going to be subtracting is 1950. So 1964 minus 1950, x will equal 14 for 1964, and 2008 minus 1950, x would equal 58 for those years. So those are some corresponding years we can have. And explain the meaning. Well, I've entered this into my calculator and find out that this equals 61.316. Explain this meaning. Well, x equaling 14 would mean that in 1964, this number 61.3, rounding it to the nearest tenth, percent voted in the election, in the presidential election. We don't know about all the things below that. Okay, so 61.3% voted in 1964. Now, they say if the model is accurate in 2012, well, we notice that this equation only went to 2008. So this is after this, and it may not be accurate, but let's find out what it is anyway. In this case, 2012 minus 1950 would, x in this case will equal 62. So I'll have 0.0155 times 62 squared minus 1.213 times 62 plus the 75.26. When I enter that into my calculator, I find out that it's 59.636. So this would say that 59.6% voted in 2012. That's what this would predict. I will tell you it's not totally accurate because I looked this information and the actual percent was 57.5% voted in the presidential election in 2012. This table gives the number of executions in the United States for selected years from 1984 to 2008. Align the data so x equals the number of years after 1980, and any of those values in list L1 in your graphing calculator and enter the executions in list L2. I'll show you how to do that. And use the graphing command to create a scatter plot for this data. Now first, let's align the data. So we want years after 1980, so we're going to subtract 1980. So my X values here will be 4, 7, 10, 13, 16, 19, 22, 25, 27, and 28. So those will be the X values that I will put in list L1, and the Y values will put in list L2, or list the number of executions listed here. To graph from a set of data. So we go to Stat, and we're going to edit. So number 1, and for 1984, that will be years after 1984. Go down, 7, 10, 27, and 28. Now we'll go to the other column and fill in our numbers. These will be the numbers of executions for each year. Now we'll need to set an appropriate window. We start with 0 and we went to 28. So let's do 0 to 30. And the executions went to 98. So let's make that 100. And maybe we'll be numbering the y-axis by tens. And here's our graph. Oops. Go back to y equals. When you don't have the graph, you will need to go up to plot 1 and then enter. Now we'll get a graph of things, because now it knows to graph the scatter plot. So here's the scatter plot of our data, and the X values we used were from 0 to 30, and the Y values we used, we have that from the window. But here's this is a scatter plot, and you can see the points are scattered around. That's what makes a scatter plot. Now for this data, we did align the X values by subtracting the 1980 from each thing. Sometimes these were small, fairly small Y values, but sometimes it is also necessary to scale the outputs by, and here, I mean, when we're aligning, we subtracted, but here we're either going to divide or multiply each number by a given number. That's so it gives us easier numbers to work with.